Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a medieval bedchamber. Not the silk-draped fantasy you might picture, but a smoky timber room where the straw mattress pokes your skin and the sound of your neighbour coughing through the thin wall is louder than your own heartbeat. You're about to learn that in this world, privacy is basically a myth. If you even think you're going to get some alone time, you'll find your younger siblings curled up on the floor next to you, grandma snoring in the corner, and maybe the family pig keeping warm by the fire. Yeah, so much for candlelit intimacy. You probably won't survive this, literally. Hygiene is poor, pregnancies are risky, and the church is always ready to remind you that fun is a sin. Still want to imagine yourself here? So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing how we're all lying in different beds around the world. Some cozy, some now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft background music, and let's get started tonight. You shuffle into that little wooden room, ducking your head because the beams are low, and immediately realize that sex, here, is not about romance. It's about function. Families are large, houses are small, and the idea of a private couple's bedroom? Almost science fiction. Most peasants lived in single-room homes where everyone slept together in one communal bed or on the floor. Yes, that includes kids, servants, and sometimes animals. That's right, even the cow was your roommate. So the sounds of rustling straw and muffled laughter in the dark didn't always come from the wind. One quirky detail. Medieval people believed sleeping together in the same bed, even platonically, helped conserve body heat. It was considered healthy. So even if you weren't in the mood, you were probably still squished up against someone else's sweaty armpit. And if you were in the mood? Well, let's just say subtlety was the real art form of medieval romance. Imagine trying to get frisky while your aunt is one cough away from... Historians still debate whether couples in peasant homes tried to wait until the house quieted down, or if they simply didn't care and just carried on. But in written accounts, neighbours often mentioned hearing unseemly noises. Translation: everybody knew your business. Medieval gossip wasn't spread by text, it was spread. Meanwhile, if you were wealthy, things were a little different, but not as private as you'd think. Nobles had larger homes, but still, rooms often doubled as public spaces. Your bed might be in the same hall where servants bustled in and out. A four-poster bed with curtains wasn't for romance, it was for shielding your activities from wandering eyes and cold drafts. That velvet curtain was basically medieval noise-cancelling headphones, except it didn't work on squeaky floors. Let's drop one historical moment here. The famous Luttrell Psalter, a 14th century manuscript, depicts a household scene where the entire family shares space for eating, working, and sleeping. It's a vivid snapshot that reminds you there was no clean division between bedroom and living room. Everything blurred together. Now picture this. You're lying in bed after a long day of fieldwork, your hair smelling like wood smoke, your feet caked in mud, and the only bath you've had this week was more of a splash than a soak. Romance? Sure, but only if you consider lice scratching at your scalp part of the mood lighting. That's the medieval foreplay. Joke's on you if you thought perfume and roses. And here's the kicker. Sex wasn't necessarily secret. The idea of intimacy being hidden behind locked doors is modern. In villages, people often assumed what married couples were up to, and newlyweds sometimes didn't even get their first night alone. Imagine rolling into bed after your wedding feast only to find your in-laws waiting to make sure you did the deed. Romantic? Not exactly. Necessary? Absolutely. Because for them, the point wasn't passion, it was producing air. So as you shift uncomfortably on that scratchy straw mattress in your imagination, remember, the medieval bedchamber wasn't about pleasure, it was about survival, community, and sometimes awkward proximity. And if you're thinking, well, at least there were no nosy neighbours with binoculars. Wrong. Your nosy neighbour was your own uncle 2 feet away pretending to be asleep. You're probably still trying to shake the straw out of your hair from last night's imaginary sleepover in that medieval cottage. But now it's time to talk about what those restless nights were really for. Marriage. Not the swipe right, fall in love, move in together kind of marriage you're used to hearing about. but the kind where your parents, your lord, and sometimes the king himself had more say in who you woke up next to than you ever did. You shuffle into a village square, and you see a young couple standing awkwardly by the church doors. She's 16, maybe younger, cheeks pale with nerves. He's 20, already with calloused hands from years of ploughing fields. Do they love each other? Maybe. Do they even know each other? Probably not. But their families have cattle to protect, fields to combine, debts to settle. And this wedding is basically a contract. For peasants, it's about pooling resources so you don't starve. For nobles, it's about alliances, land. One quirky little detail. In many villages, marriages could be hand-fasted, meaning you literally tied the couple's hands together in front of witnesses to seal the deal. Forget the ring box reveal. You got rope. Historians still debate whether love played a significant role in peasant marriages, or if it was mostly practical necessity. Some records suggest genuine affection could develop, especially since couples often lived and worked side by side from dawn till dusk. But others show that in-laws were basically the third wheel in your entire marriage, always reminding you that the family name mattered more than your feelings. And the church? Oh, the church had plenty to say about who you could and couldn't marry. Cousins? Nope, too close. Marrying without a priest? Technically still valid, but frowned upon. And if you dared to marry outside your social class, good luck explaining that one at confession. The medieval church viewed marriage as a sacrament, but one that existed mainly to control sex, which meant that without marriage, any little fling you had was instantly labelled sinful. Talk about pressure. Let's zoom in on one historical moment, the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Louis VII in 1137. At just 15, Eleanor was already heiress to a massive duchy. Her marriage wasn't about love, it was about land. France gained Aquitaine overnight. Their union was a royal chess move, not a love story. Spoiler alert, it didn't last. She later married Henry II of England and helped shape the political map of Europe. Her personal happiness, probably at the bottom of the priority list. Meanwhile, in peasant homes, weddings were much simpler but still serious. Imagine your wedding feast being less catered buffet with champagne, and more bread, ale, and maybe a roasted chicken if you're lucky. Then, as soon as the food is cleared, everyone's already whispering about when you'll get around to making babies. And make no mistake, that was the point. Love was nice if it showed up, but heirs were mandatory. Picture yourself standing there in a rough wool tunic, a wreath of herbs on your head, feeling everyone's eyes on you as vows are exchanged. You don't get to say "I do" with a flourish. You just sort of nod because the priest said so. And before you know it, the village expects you to head off to bed and, well, make the contract official. But that's another scene coming up. Here's your light-hearted joke break. Medieval parents didn't ask, "Do you like him?" They asked, "Does he own 2 oxen?" That's like swiping on Tinder because someone listed owns an iPhone 15 in their bio. So, marriage in medieval times was less about fluttering hearts and candlelit kisses, and more about land deeds and livestock counts. And as you lie back and imagine being paired off at 16 with the boy down the road simply because your fathers agreed to it over mugs of ale, you realise your love life wasn't really yours to control. So, you've just been shoved into a marriage you didn't exactly choose, and now you're wondering what happens next when the candles are snuffed out. Here's the fun part. The church decided to climb into bed with you, figuratively, but sometimes it felt literal. You shuffle into the parish records, and you see long lists of rules. Rules about when you could do it, how you could do it, and in which position it was even acceptable. Spoiler, spontaneity was not exactly encouraged. The medieval church treated sex like fire. Dangerous if uncontrolled, but useful if it produced children. Missionary position, approved, barely. Anything else? Sinful. Reverse cowgirl, straight ticket to hell. Oral sex, double damnation. And don't even think about trying it on Sundays, holy days, Lent, Advent, or while fasting. Yes, that meant nearly half the calendar was off limits. Imagine checking your seasonal calendar before you kissed your spouse. Sorry, honey. The bishop says it's not allowed until next month. Here's one quirky tidbit. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas wrote entire passages explaining why sex should only be about procreation. If you enjoyed it too much, sin. If your partner enjoyed it too much, also sin. Basically, Medieval priests were the original fun police. And yet, the very fact they kept writing these detailed rules suggests people weren't exactly... Historians still debate whether everyday folks followed these rules strictly, or if they just shrugged and carried on in private. Confession records hint that people frequently slipped, and priests doled out penances. One common punishment was fasting on bread and water for weeks. Imagine explaining that awkward slip-up. "Forgive me, Father, for I sinned on St. Swithin's Day." Let's zoom in on one historical case, the penitentials, those medieval handbooks for confessors. They outlined every imaginable sexual sin and the exact penance attached. For example, sleeping with your wife on a forbidden day might earn you 40 days of fasting. Fornication with someone else's wife? Years of penance. The lists were so detailed that reading them feels almost voyeuristic, like the priests were keeping score of everyone's late night. You crouch in the dim light of a stone church, listening to a priest explain how your wedding bed is holy only if you keep it pure. The irony? Many priests were not exactly saints themselves, as we'll get to later. But for now, you're just sweating, because every little desire you have feels like... And here's your joke break. If the church had an app back then, it wouldn't be Tinder. It would be Chastity Calendar. Swipe left if it's Lent, swipe... Despite all this, medieval people weren't robots. They laughed, flirted, and found ways around the rules. Bed curtains weren't just for warmth, after all. And while the priests wrote, scolded, and thundered from pulpits, behind closed doors the human urge was stronger than any sermon. The rules might shape your guilt, but they rarely... So, as you lie there on that rough mattress, sneaking a kiss under the blanket and praying no one hears, you realize the church didn't just shape your sex life, it practically choreographed it. And yet, like every dance, there was always room for improvisation. You've sat through the feast, you've endured the negotiations, and now everyone in the hall is buzzing with anticipation. Tonight's main event is not the roasted goose or the fiddlers. No, it's you. Welcome to the medieval wedding night, where private intimacy is treated more like a community. You shuffle into the bedchamber, but before you can even close the door, half the wedding guests follow you in. The room smells of wine, sweat, and burning tallow candles. Someone's laughing too loudly, another's hiccuping, and the local priest is standing by like the ultimate chaperone. Curtains? Forget it. Your marriage isn't official until everyone sees it happen, or at least sees enough to confirm the union is real. Imagine rolling into bed while your in-laws lean against the wall, arms crossed, muttering encouragement like football coaches. Romantic, right? One quirky detail. In some noble households, it was tradition to escort the bride and groom to bed with music, cheering, and even dirty jokes whispered by the bridesmaids. They called it bedding the couple, and yes, it was exactly as awkward as it sounds. Servants might help undress the bride, not out of kindness but to prove she wasn't hiding anything under those layers of linen. The whole thing was half celebrated. Historians still debate how widespread these public consummations really were. Some argue it was mostly a noble tradition, meant to guarantee legitimacy for heirs, while peasants likely kept it simpler. But accounts from courts and chronicles make it clear, at least for the elite, your first night was never really yours. It belonged to your family, your dynasty, and unfortunately, your nosy cousin Geoffrey, who couldn't keep a straight face while... Let's spotlight a historical moment. In 1429, King Henry VI of England married Margaret of Anjou. Records show the bedding ceremony was treated as a public ritual. The royal couple was escorted to their chamber in full view of courtiers. Curtains were drawn eventually, but the symbolism was clear. This wasn't just a marriage of two people, it was the binding of two kingdoms. And everybody wanted proof that the king was doing his royal duty. Now imagine being a teenage bride in this scenario, wrapped in heavy brocade, your hands trembling as servants tug at laces. You glance at your new husband. He's nervous too, though he tries to play it cool. The bed itself creaks under the weight of carved oak, stuffed with straw that scratches like hay. As you climb in, the room bursts into cheers, and you feel heat in your face that has nothing to do with attraction. You're blushing because 50 pairs of eyes are staring, waiting. Here's your light joke break. Medieval wedding nights were the only time in history where audience participation was both literal and deeply unwanted. Imagine trying to set the mood with your uncle yelling, "Go on, lad!" from the corner. But why was this all so important? Legitimacy. In a world where land and power passed through bloodlines, it mattered that heirs were unquestionably legitimate. Public bedding, or at least public acknowledgement of consummation, acted as a safeguard against future disputes. If anyone later claimed the marriage wasn't real, dozens of witnesses could swear they saw the couple head to bed and start the process. Think of it as medieval notarization, except a lot more embarrassing. Even outside noble courts, pressure for public proof lingered. Some towns demanded the couple display bloodied sheets the next morning to prove the bride's virginity. Families paraded them through streets like a victory banner. If there wasn't blood, rumors spread fast. Was she not a virgin? Was he incapable? Either way, whispers turned to gossip. And gossip, of course, not every couple managed a storybook consummation under pressure. Some records describe grooms drinking too much wine and collapsing before anything happened. Others hint at brides so terrified they fainted. In such cases, the priest or relatives might insist on a retry the next night. The phrase performance anxiety doesn't even begin. Historians still debate how traumatic these ceremonies were versus how normalized they might have felt to participants. In cultures where communal life was standard, maybe couples didn't find it as shocking as we do today. But the surviving descriptions suggest at least some level of awkwardness. After all, even in a world without personal space, few people truly wanted their first night narrated by relatives. Another historical gem. In France, certain aristocratic weddings included bawdy songs sung by guests outside the chamber, timed to the noises they hoped to hear from within. Imagine having your sex life soundtracked by a medieval choir with lutes. Not exactly Spotify's romantic mood playlist. You lean back into the straw mattress, the chatter slowly fading as curtains are pulled. But the pressure doesn't end there. Everyone expects results, preferably a pregnancy within the year. If nothing happens, you'll hear whispers of curses, impotence, or divine punishment. Your love life has become a public scoreboard, and everyone in the village is keeping track. And here's another light-hearted thought. If medieval people had Yelp, newlyweds would be getting one-star reviews for lack of enthusiasm on the wedding night. Still, amid all the scrutiny, some couples did find ways to laugh, connect, and turn the ordeal into their own memory. Maybe they whispered jokes under the blanket. Maybe they comforted each other's nerves. Even in a world of surveillance, so as you imagine lying there, sweat beading on your forehead, knowing tomorrow the sheets will be inspected, remember, the medieval wedding night wasn't a private celebration of love. It was a performance, a proof, and a reminder that in this world, your body wasn't just yours. It was part of the family contract, signed in sweat and sealed in whispers. You wake up the morning after that very public, very awkward wedding night, and before you can even stretch the straw out of your back, people are already whispering, did they? Didn't they? Was there blood on the sheets? And while all that gossip swirls, you quickly learn one of the harshest truths of medieval life. Just because you're married doesn't mean you're faithful, or that everyone else is either. Welcome to the world of forbidden affairs, where lust often outweighed loyalty. You shuffle through a castle corridor, torches sputtering on the stone walls, and notice a servant girl slipping quietly into the chamber of a nobleman. This is no innocent errand. By dawn she'll sneak back out, cheeks flushed, her reputation hanging by a thread. Affairs were everywhere in medieval society, between kings and mistresses, between priests and parishioners, between bored wives and handsome squires. Marriage may have been about contracts, but desire didn't always care about paperwork. One quirky detail. The famous court records of the Paris consistory in the 14th century reveal endless cases of adultery. Husbands accused wives, wives accused husbands, neighbours tattled on neighbours. The punishments ranged from fines to public shaming. But here's the funny part. Sometimes the punishments were so light that people risked it anyway. A few coins and some prayers might clear your name, at least in the eyes of the historians still debate how common adultery really was among peasants compared to nobles. For peasants, life was exhausting. Long days in the fields, small houses, no privacy. Some argue there simply wasn't time or space for elaborate affairs. For nobles, though, with their larger households and travelling spouses, opportunities were plentiful. A night away on campaign, a lady at home with only servants and a charming minstrel. Let's drop into a historical moment. King Philip IV of France and the infamous Tour de Nesle affair in 1314. His 3 daughters-in-law were accused of adultery with knights. 2 were imprisoned for life, and 1 was reportedly executed after her lover was caught and brutally punished. Whether exaggerated or true, the scandal rocked Europe, showing how affairs weren't just personal, they were political dynamite. A queen's elegy. Meanwhile, in a village tavern, the atmosphere was different but no less risky. Picture yourself sipping rough ale while watching the miller's wife giggle with a young farmhand. Everyone pretends not to notice, but tomorrow the whole village will know. Affairs here were whispered in corners, hinted at during confession, and joked about in bawdy songs. They were both scandalous and strangely routine. Here's your light joke break. If medieval Facebook existed, half the status updates would read, "It's complicated, priest won't stop checking in." But the church didn't find it funny. Adultery was considered a mortal sin, capable of damning your soul. Priests preached fiery sermons about eternal punishment, while courts sometimes ordered adulterers paraded through town half-dressed, jeered at by neighbours. Imagine your personal drama turned into street theatre, complete with rotten vegetables. And yet, despite the risks, desire kept winning. Letters survived from noble lovers exchanging poems, tokens, and promises. Some even carved secret messages into castle walls. Archaeologists have found graffiti of hearts and initials in medieval keeps, the original carving your crush's name in a tree move. For women, the danger was greater. A man might pay a fine, but a woman caught in an affair risked her reputation, her dowry, even her life. Still, records show plenty took the risk. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was rebellion against controlling families. Or maybe simply it was the universal truth. People crave connection, even when forbidden. Another famous case, Abelard and Heloise in 12th century Paris. He was a philosopher, she was his brilliant student, and their affair became legendary. When she became pregnant, scandal erupted. Her family's retaliation was brutal. Abelard was castrated. Yet their letters reveal passion, wit, and an intellectual bond that outlived even the affair itself. Their story shows how affairs could be tragic, yet profoundly human. You picture yourself in that candle-lit chamber, sneaking glances at someone you shouldn't, your heart racing faster than the flicker of the flame. You know the risks. If caught, shame could follow you to the grave. But in that stolen moment, the world feels wider, freer, more alive. That's the forbidden thrill medieval lovers chased. And here's one last joke for this sleepless night. Medieval affairs were basically the Netflix of the time. Dangerous, addictive, and guaranteed to keep everyone talking. So, as you slip quietly back into your own straw bed, heart still pounding, remember, in the medieval world, sex wasn't just about marriage contracts or church rules. It was also about the forbidden glances, the whispered promises, and the dangerous thrill of breaking all the rules. You've seen nobles tumble into scandal, but now you shuffle out of the castle and into the dirt paths of a peasant village. Forget silk sheets and courtly poetry. The love life of the average farmer was built around survival, hard work, and the constant presence of family and neighbours. If marriage among nobles was about politics, for peasants it was about keeping food on the table. But that didn't mean desire disappeared. It just looked different, simpler, earthier, and sometimes shockingly casual. You step into a smoky tavern at dusk, the air thick with ale fumes and laughter. The benches creak under the weight of tired farmers, and in the corner a fiddler scrapes out a tune. Here's where flirtation happened. Peasant desire often started not in private gardens, but in these crowded rooms. A smile across the bench, a jug shared, a dance that lingered longer than propriety allowed. For young men and women, taverns were tinder with more mud. One quirky detail. In some villages, young men would woo women by bundling, literally climbing into bed fully clothed and lying together under a blanket. The idea was to encourage intimacy without actual sex, though you can imagine how often that rule was bent. Some communities even supervised bundling with parents nearby, which is either the most awkward chaperone situation in history or a form of medieval comedy. Historians still debate whether bundling was widespread, or just a regional quirk in parts of northern Europe. Some argue it was a practical solution to long winters and small houses, a way to test compatibility without breaking strict church rules. Others suspect it was just an excuse for young people to push boundaries while pretending innocence. Either way, the practice shows how desire found cracks in even the most controlled environments. Let's anchor this in a historical moment. In 14th century England, court rolls record multiple cases where couples were fined for fornication before marriage. The details suggest that while everyone knew young people fooled around, the authorities used fines more as a revenue stream than a serious deterrent. Your hormones could literally become a taxable offence. You wander further into the village and peek inside a peasant home. The family's one-room cottage smells of smoke, damp wool, and animals. Privacy? Non-existent. A young couple shares a straw pallet in the corner while siblings, parents, and maybe a pig all settle down nearby. If they wanted intimacy, they had to be very, very quiet, or very, very shameless. Many didn't bother hiding much, which explains why so many medieval sermons thundered about immodest behaviour. Priests weren't inventing those sins out of nowhere. They heard about them straight from gossiping parishioners. Here's your joke break. If medieval peasants had a safe word, it was probably, "Shh, your mom's right there." Still, passion thrived. Folk songs collected centuries later show a bawdy streak in peasant culture, full of jokes about milkmaids and ploughboys sneaking into haylofts. These weren't elite romances. They were earthy, funny, and often shockingly blunt. In an age when literacy was rare, songs carried the themes of desire, heartbreak, and scandal from one generation to the next. For women, though, peasant love was risky. A premarital pregnancy could spell disaster. Without wealth or powerful family to shield them, unmarried mothers often faced shame, fines, or abandonment. Some villages forced men to pay child support if proven the father, but proving it was tricky in a world without DNA tests. So young women had to walk a razor's edge, enjoying affection while protecting. Another historical example, the case of Alice de Riper in 1272 England, who was fined for fornication with John the Shepherd. Both names appear in court records, along with the small fine they had to pay. No jail, no exile, just money. For the church, sin was bad. For local lords, it was profitable. And yet, even with these risks, peasants married young. Girls might wed at 14 or 15, boys a bit older once they could support a family. Love sometimes grew later, born of shared hardship. Imagine two people trudging through muddy fields day after day, ploughing, sowing, harvesting. Desire was less about candlelit passion and more about solidarity. When your body aches from labour, a partner's touch feels like survival. Still, gossip followed everywhere. A couple caught sneaking kisses behind the barn might end up the butt of jokes at the tavern. Medieval humour was merciless. Think of it as the original meme culture, except instead of a viral post, it was a bawdy rhyme everyone sang about you at the next feast. And here's one more joke for the night. Medieval peasants didn't need Netflix and chill. They had haylofts and hope nobody walked in. So as you lie back, picturing yourself in that cramped, smoky cottage, surrounded by family and farm animals, you realise peasant desire wasn't glamorous, but it was raw, immediate, and undeniably human. They didn't have silks or perfumes, but they had warmth, laughter, and fleeting moments of passion stolen between chores. And for many, that was enough. You've walked through smoky cottages and sweaty taverns, but now you're stepping into a polished great hall, where torches flicker against painted walls and tapestries whisper tales of knights and maidens. Here, sex isn't about survival or awkward family proximity. It's about longing, poetry, and the dangerous dance of courtly love. Forget bundling in haylofts. Nobles invented an entire... You shuffle closer to a corner where a young troubadour strums a lute, eyes fixed on a lady of the court. His song isn't about crops or chores. It's about her golden hair, her bright eyes, her unattainable perfection. Everyone in the hall knows she's married to a powerful lord who sits at the high table, but that doesn't stop the performer from filling the air with verses so sweet you almost blush just listening. In the noble world, forbidden attraction wasn't just tolerated, it was expected, as long as it stayed dressed in metaphor and music. One quirky detail: knights sometimes wore a lady's sleeve, veil, or token into battle as a sign of devotion. Imagine riding into combat with your crush's embroidered handkerchief tied to your helmet, trying to look fierce while basically advertising Taken. It wasn't about actual affairs, at least not openly. It was about channeling desire into loyalty, turning lust into noble inspiration. Of course, everyone knew the poetry often disguised. Historians still debate how real these courtly love relationships were. Some argue it was mostly performance, a way to add drama to noble life. Others point to surviving letters and suggest genuine passion often simmered beneath the flowery words. Either way, courtly love became one of the defining cultural features of medieval Europe, shaping literature, music, and even politics. Let's spotlight a historical moment: the troubadour tradition of 12th century southern France, where poets like Bernard de Ventadorn composed songs about unattainable ladies. His verses describe a love so overwhelming it nearly destroys him. Was it exaggeration? Maybe. But his patrons included noblewomen who must have enjoyed hearing themselves cast as radiant goddesses while their husbands looked on pretending not to notice. You wander into the gardens at dusk, where noble couples stroll under carved stone arches. They can't hold hands openly, but their glances carry more heat than a dozen kisses. Courtly love thrived on restraint, on pretending to obey the rules while bending them just enough to keep desire alive. Picture yourself in a velvet gown or a suit of armor, whispering riddles and compliments that sound innocent to outsiders, but burn with secret meaning between you and... Here's your joke break. If medieval nobles had text messaging, it would have been all poetry. Roses are red, violets are blue, I'm stuck in a loveless marriage. Courtly games could turn surprisingly physical, though. Dances, tournaments, and hunting parties created opportunities for more than just words. A knight might engineer a rescue during a hunt, or a lady might drop a glove for him to retrieve, sparking gossip for weeks. Everyone was in on the drama, and part of the thrill was how public secrecy could be. But it wasn't all harmless fun. Affairs between nobles could threaten entire dynasties. If a lady of rank bore a child rumoured not to be her husband's, inheritance disputes followed. That's why courtly love often worked best when it stayed symbolic, burning passion on paper, plausible deniability in reality. Still, diaries and private letters that survive hint that plenty of noble couples slipped beyond metaphor. The poems may have been flowery, but the haylofts were still there. Another famous example, Lancelot and Guinevere in Arthurian legend. Though fictional, their story captured medieval imaginations precisely because it reflected real anxieties about loyalty, passion, and betrayal. A knight devoted to his king, yet hopelessly in love with the queen. It was scandalous, thrilling, and all too believable. And courtly love wasn't limited to men chasing women. Women, too, became patrons of poets, commissioning songs in their honour, playing the game with wit and intelligence. Eleanor of Aquitaine herself was said to preside over courts of love, where noble ladies judged cases of romance like mock trials. Did a knight's devotion count as true love, or was it mere lust? The debates were half serious, half entertainment, but they reveal just how central desire had become to noble culture. You lean against the carved stone balustrade, listening to the night air filled with soft lute notes, and realize this wasn't about privacy. It was about spectacle. Courtly love allowed nobles to turn passion into performance, transforming personal longing into social theatre. And while the peasants had bundling boards and gossip, the nobles had poems, tournaments, and scandals whispered behind fans. Here's another light-hearted jab. Courtly love was basically medieval fan fiction, except the authors sometimes ended up in bed with their readers. So as you drift off, imagining yourself as the knight sneaking glances at a married lady, or the noblewoman whispering to a love-struck poet, remember, in medieval courts, sex and love weren't just private urges. They were games, songs, and sometimes weapons, played out under torchlight, with the whole world watching from the shadows. You've heard the music and the whispers of noble flirtations, but tonight the tone shifts. You shuffle into a dimly lit chamber where a girl sits nervously on the edge of a bed, a sheet clutched in her fists. Around her, older women hover like hawks. This isn't about poetry or passion. This is about virginity, the medieval obsession that turned up. Virginity in this world was treated like treasure, like a sealed contract, like proof of worth. For women especially, it wasn't just a state of being, it was currency. A family's honor, a dowry's value, and even political alliances hinged on whether a bride was untouched. Men, of course, weren't held to the same impossible standards. A groom might boast about conquests, but a bride's body was expected to carry the burden of purity. One quirky detail. In some regions, proof of virginity after the wedding night required the couple to show blood-stained sheets to witnesses the next morning. Imagine staggering out of bed at dawn, exhausted and embarrassed, while your mother-in-law demands to see the linens like she's checking a receipt. And if the sheets were clean? Panic. Gossip spread fast, reputations shattered, and in some cases entire marriages were. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was. Some argue it was common only in noble households, where inheritance disputes made proof essential. Others suggest even peasants faced similar pressures, with communities gossiping endlessly about whether a girl was pure. Either way, the obsession with proof reveals a society where women's bodies were. Let's anchor this with a historical case. In 1381, Marjorie Paston of England faced scrutiny over her virginity during marriage negotiations. The Paston Letters, a rare surviving collection of family correspondence, reveal how much pressure fell on noble daughters to prove chastity. Families discussed their daughters' reputations in cold transactional terms, like merchants haggling over goods. You picture yourself lying in that chamber, knowing that what happens or doesn't happen tonight could define your entire future. The weight is crushing. The room smells of beeswax and lavender water, but the air feels suffocating. You hear laughter in the hall, but inside it's deadly serious. Virginity isn't just about you. It's about your family's standing, your husband's pride, and your community's judgment. Here's your joke break. If medieval people had Yelp, brides would get reviews like 5 stars, blood on the sheet, marriage confirmed, would recommend. Of course, not all women bled their first time. Modern science tells us the hymen is unpredictable, and not every bride's body works according to medieval expectations. But try explaining anatomy to a group of in-laws, sharpening their judgmental stares. Some desperate brides pricked their fingers to smear blood on sheets, a quiet act of rebellion against impossible demands. And then there were virginity tests. Yes, actual tests. Medieval medical texts describe examining a woman's body, sometimes checking her urine, her gait, even her tightness, in shockingly invasive ways, to determine whether she was pure. Needless to say, these methods were neither accurate nor fair, but they show the extremes to which societies went to control female sexuality. Another famous moment, Joan of Arc, during her trial in 1431, was examined multiple times by clerics to verify her virginity. Why? Because her chastity was central to her image as God's chosen warrior. Her body became evidence in a political and spiritual battle, dissected by men who held her life in their hands. Meanwhile, men. Their virginity was barely mentioned. A groom might be teased for being inexperienced, but no one demanded proof. The double standard was staggering, and women bore the weight of it. Still, virginity carried power in its own way. A chaste bride was prized, but a chaste nun was revered. For some women, joining a convent and vowing virginity offered an escape from forced marriages. It was one of the few ways to take control, even if cloistered life had its own. And here's one last laugh. Medieval virginity was like a medieval iPhone. Everyone wanted proof it was brand new, but nobody really knew how to check properly. So as you settle into the quiet dark, picturing yourself under those watchful eyes, you realize medieval sex wasn't just about bodies. It was about reputation, politics, and the fragile line between honor and ruin. And in a world where blood on a sheet could decide your fate, intimacy was never just personal. It was public judgment, written in red. You've endured the awkward inspections of virginity, but tonight you shuffle past the heavy oak doors of a cloister. The air smells of incense and damp stone, the silence broken only by the faint chanting of psalms. You expect purity here, a place removed from temptation. Yet the deeper you walk into the cloister, the more you realize desire does not respect vows. Behind convent walls and monastery gates, monks and nuns, you wander into a dormitory of monks, rows of straw pallets lined up neatly, candlelight flickering across faces bowed in prayer. But not all prayers were pious. Records from church courts reveal that monks were often caught with secret lovers, sometimes local women, sometimes even fellow monks. The vow of chastity may have been spoken aloud, but human nature whispered louder at night. One quirky detail: some monasteries installed grills or barred windows so that nuns and monks could speak without touching. But confessions through iron bars often turned into flirtations, and flirtations sometimes turned into plans for midnight trysts. A wall was no match for hormones. Historians still debate how rampant these affairs were. Some argue they were exaggerated by critics of the church, eager to discredit clerics. Others point to countless court cases, papal bulls, and even scandals that suggest they were common enough to be a serious concern. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Plenty of monks and nuns lived devout lives, but others quietly bent their vows under cover of night. Let's anchor this with a historical moment. In the 14th century, Bishop Thomas Arundel of Canterbury conducted visitations to monasteries and reported shocking misconduct. In one nunnery, he accused the sisters of having indecent familiarity with priests who visited. In another, monks were said to have kept mistresses openly. The scandals became so notorious that reform movements sprang up, trying to restore discipline. You peek into a convent refectory where nuns sip thin broth in silence. Their eyes, though, sometimes wander to the visiting priest who blesses the meal. Rumours swirl in local villages of hidden pregnancies and babies spirited away to foundling homes. Some chronicles even accuse midwives of being employed secretly by convents. Whether true or not, the gossip reveals just how suspicious medieval society was of cloisters. Holiness and hypocrisy lived. Here's your joke break. If medieval monasteries had dating apps, they'd be called Plenty of Psalms. And not all scandals stayed hidden. One notorious case in 1318 involved the nuns of St. Mary's in Winchester, accused of turning their convent into what the bishop called a house of debauchery. He described how wealthy men visited frequently, how the sisters wore fancy clothes, and how vows of chastity were treated more like polite suggestions. Was he exaggerating? Perhaps. But the scandal reveals how, at the same time, not all stories were salacious. Some nuns formed deep emotional bonds with one another. Letters survive showing language of passionate affection, even love. Historians still debate whether these relationships were sexual or simply expressions of intense friendship. Either way, they remind us that behind the stone walls, real human hearts beat, longing for connection. Another famous example, Peter Damian, a reforming monk of the 11th century, wrote fiery tracts condemning unnatural vice among clerics. His language was so specific that modern scholars suspect he was describing real cases of same-sex relationships within monasteries. Again, whether exaggerated or not, the accusations show that cloisters were not immune to the same temptations as the outside world. You sit on a cold stone bench, the chant of Compline echoing around you, and imagine the weight of those vows. To renounce the world was to renounce desire, but desire is stubborn. For some, it twisted into guilt-ridden secrets. For others, it burst into scandal that shook entire dioceses. And for a few, perhaps, it blossomed into quiet companionship that made cloistered life bearable. And here's one last laugh. Monks may have promised poverty, chastity, and obedience, but 2 out of 3 on a good day wasn't bad. So as you drift into sleep, hearing the echoes of chants mingled with whispers in the cloisters, remember, the medieval church wasn't just a watchdog of morality. It was also full of human contradictions, where vows of purity met the messy realities of desire. You've seen monks whisper through grills and nuns wrestle with vows, but tonight you shuffle into a physician's study, the shelves stacked with jars of herbs, dried roots, and manuscripts bound in worn leather. A candle sputters in the corner, and the air smells faintly of rosemary and mildew. Here, sex isn't forbidden or celebrated. It's diagnosed. Welcome to the bizarre world of medieval medical myths about sexuality, where doctors insisted that your body worked like a system of leaky pipes and hot furnaces. You glance at a page in a manuscript and see drawings of naked figures with labels in Latin. The text explains how men are hot and dry by nature, while women are cold and moist. Yes, that was the actual medical theory, straight from Galen and Aristotle. The conclusion? Women supposedly needed more sexual activity to balance their humours. Too little, and they might become sickly or hysterical. Too much, and they risked madness. You can almost hear a medieval physician saying, "Well, madam, the cure for your headache is clearly more intercourse." One quirky detail. Some medical writers claimed that women could not conceive unless they experienced pleasure. They believed both men and women had to orgasm for conception to occur, because each produced seed that mingled to create life. That idea gave women's pleasure a strange kind of importance, even though society generally denied them sexual agency. Imagine husbands nervously asking, "Did you finish?" Historians still debate how seriously everyday people believed these theories. Some argue medical ideas stayed within scholarly circles, while others note that remedies and advice often trickled down through midwives, priests, and folk healers. Whether or not peasants quoted Galen, they probably absorbed some version of the idea that women's health was tied to sexual activity. Let's anchor this with a historical moment. The Trotula, a famous set of medical texts from 12th century Salerno, written by, or at least attributed to, a woman physician named Trotta. These works gave extensive advice on women's health, including fertility, menstruation, and sexual pleasure. The text even recommended herbs and ointments to excite desire. It's one of the rare glimpses into how seriously medieval medicine considered female sexuality, even if through a bizarre and sometimes comical lens. You peer at another page describing cures for frigidity or lack of desire. Remedies included warm baths, spicy foods, and rubbing certain salves on the body. Some suggested holding roasted animal parts near the genitals to restore warmth. Yes, you heard that right. Imagine your doctor handing you a prescription for apply cooked goat liver nightly. Here's your joke break. If WebMD existed in the 14th century, every symptom would end with the same advice. Have more sex, and also try leeches. But the strangest myths weren't always about women. Men, too, got their share of bizarre treatments. Physicians warned against too much sex, claiming it drained a man's vital essence. Excessive release of semen was said to weaken the body, cause memory loss, or even shorten life. Monks used this argument to scare young novices, saying they'd grow weak or mad if they succumbed to temptation. Yet at the same time, doctors insisted that moderate sex was necessary for health. Mixed messages much? Another famous example. Medical texts described a condition called uterine suffocation, supposedly caused when a woman went too long without sex. The uterus, they believed, would wander around the body, pressing against organs and causing hysteria. Treatments included fumigating the vagina with herbs, or more bluntly, encouraging intercourse. The wandering womb theory sounds absurd now, but it shaped centuries. You picture yourself as a patient, sitting nervously while a bearded physician scribbles notes by candlelight. He prescribes a poultice of wine-soaked herbs to awaken desire, followed by a stern lecture about keeping your humours balanced. You leave the chamber more confused than when you entered, clutching a bundle of garlic and wondering whether you're supposed to eat it or rub it somewhere embarrassing. And here's another laugh. Medieval medicine was basically Google search history gone wrong, half superstition, half try this weird trick, doctors hate it. Yet amid the myths, some knowledge was surprisingly practical. Midwives and physicians knew certain herbs, like pennyroyal and rue, could affect fertility. They recognized links between diet, stress, and reproductive health. And while they wrapped it all in theories of humours and wandering wombs, their advice sometimes worked. What we see as superstition may have offered genuine comfort in a way. So as you lie back, picturing yourself under the care of a medieval doctor, remember, sex here wasn't just about sin or love. It was medicine, health, and sometimes pure comedy. Your desire could be a diagnosis, your body a battlefield of hot and cold humours. And in a world without modern science, sometimes the cure was stranger than the illness. You leave the physician's study, your head spinning with nonsense about wandering wombs and roasted goat livers, and you shuffle into the noisy streets of a medieval city. The smell hits first, smoke, sweat, spices, and something less pleasant drifting from open sewers. But mixed into the bustle of merchants, tinkers, and beggars is another profession entirely: sex work. Brothels weren't hidden underground in shameful corners. They were part of the urban economy, regulated, taxed, and sometimes even you glance up and see a painted sign swaying above a crooked wooden doorway. Maybe it's a red boot, maybe a stag's head, maybe just a crude sketch of a woman. It's advertising. Inside, the air is heavy with cheap perfume and ale. Women sit on benches, their dresses cut lower than usual, smiling at passing men. Some look bored, others practiced, a few even amused. For them, sex isn't romance, it's livelihood. One quirky detail. In many medieval towns, prostitutes had to wear special clothing to mark their trade. In some places, a striped hood. In others, a yellow veil. Think of it as a medieval uniform. But instead of helping customers find them, it often reinforced stigma. Everyone knew who they were, yet the city relied on their taxes. Historians still debate whether municipal authorities promoted brothels mainly to control male desire, better in a brothel than in respectable homes, they argued, or to profit off sin through taxation. Likely both. Records from cities like Nuremberg, Paris and London show brothels listed on tax rolls alongside bakers and blacksmiths. The paradox was glaring. Preachers thundered against prostitution from the pulpit, while city treasurers quietly counted the coins it brought in. Let's ground this in a historical example. In 1358, the city of Avignon, home to the papacy at the time, ran a municipal brothel known as the Maison des Filles. Yes, even under the shadow of the Pope's palace, prostitution was institutionalized. The brothel had official rules, fees, and operating hours. Customers paid not only for the services, but indirectly to keep city coffers full. Hypocrisy much? You wander deeper and find the hierarchy within this world. At the top, high-class courtesans entertained wealthy merchants and nobles, offering witty conversation, music, and companionship alongside intimacy. They wore silk gowns, dined on fine food, and sometimes influenced politics. At the bottom, streetwalkers sold themselves for pennies in alleys, often at great risk of violence or disease. Between them stood the brothel workers, bound. Here's your joke break. If Yelp existed, medieval brothels would have had reviews like, "Great atmosphere, ale was watered down, would not recommend the lute player." But jokes aside, sex work was dangerous. Many women were coerced into it, orphans, widows, or those abandoned by families. Others entered by choice, preferring coins over starvation. Either way, their bodies became part of the urban economy, a commodity traded and taxed. Cities justified this by calling prostitution a necessary evil. Better, they argued, to contain lust than let it run wild. It was damage control dressed up as morality. Another historical note. In London, Southwark's brothels were licensed by the Bishop of Winchester. The workers were even nicknamed Winchester geese. Imagine paying taxes not just to the city, but to a church authority who publicly condemned your existence. Double standards never go out of style. And it wasn't only women. Records mention male prostitutes too, though more rarely, often serving other men in secret. These cases, when uncovered, faced harsher punishment because same-sex activity was criminalized. Yet their presence in court rolls proves they existed despite the risk. Diseases, of course, haunted this trade. Before syphilis exploded in the late 15th century, gonorrhea and other infections circulated widely. Without medicine, treatment was mostly herbal salves, purges, or desperate prayers to saints. Many sex workers died young, not from scandal but from illness. Yet for centuries the trade persisted, fueled by demand and tolerated by authority. You pause outside a brothel door, the muffled sound of laughter spilling into the street. To medieval eyes, this wasn't just sin, it was infrastructure. Like taverns, markets and mills, brothels filled a need society couldn't or wouldn't eliminate. They were a mirror, reflecting the contradictions of a culture obsessed with controlling desire while profiting from. And here's one last joke for the night. Medieval brothels were basically fast food chains. Everyone pretended to be ashamed, but business was always booming. So as you imagine yourself walking back into the lamplight, purse a little lighter, ears filled with music and whispers, you realize medieval sex wasn't confined to private homes or noble courts. It spilled into the streets, into the economy, and into the laws that tried to control it. And in those bustling, smoky brothels, desire wasn't just personal, it was business. You step away from the noise of the brothel streets, only to stumble into another kind of theatre, punishment. In the medieval world, sex outside the approved boundaries wasn't just whispered about. It could land you in the stocks, paraded half-naked through town, or worse. Tonight you shuffle into a crowded marketplace where the bells are tolling, and everyone has gathered not for trade but for scandal. Two villagers, an adulterous wife and her lover, are being dragged forward, their heads hung low as the crowd jeers. Punishments for sexual misconduct were public, humiliating, and designed to make examples. Adultery, fornication, prostitution outside licensed areas, even lewd speech, could bring fines or worse. But adultery especially drew fire, since it disrupted family honor and inheritance. For men, it might mean paying compensation or enduring a few days in the stocks. For women, it could mean lifelong disgrace, loss of dowry, or banishment. The double standard, as always, was sharp. One quirky detail. In some German towns, adulterers were forced to ride backward on a donkey through the streets while carrying a large wooden symbol of shame, sometimes a broom, sometimes a set of oversized horns, a reference to cuckoldry. Imagine wobbling down cobblestones trying not to fall, while the entire village howls with laughter. It was punishment and entertainment rolled into one. Historians still debate whether these punishments were applied consistently. Some records suggest that wealthy men often escaped with fines, while poor couples bore the brunt of humiliation. Others argue that communities were surprisingly egalitarian when enforcing sexual morality, with even nobles occasionally dragged through scandal. Either way, the spectacle was unforgettable, and deliberately so. Let's anchor this in a historical moment. In 1387, London records describe a woman named Alice Grimston being punished for adultery by walking barefoot through the city carrying a torch. She was made an example to remind others of the dangers of unchaste living. The chronicler doesn't mention her partner's fate, which probably means he got off easier, a classic medieval shrugged. You watch as the crowd throws cabbage leaves and jeers at the accused. Children chant rhymes, neighbours gossip, and merchants pause their trade to enjoy the show. Punishment wasn't just discipline. It was community theatre. Everyone participated, reinforcing the rules by mocking those who... Here's your joke break. Medieval punishments were basically the original reality TV. Same drama, less commercial break. But not all consequences were so light. In harsher cases, adultery could mean exile, mutilation, or even death. In some Italian city-states, women caught in repeated affairs were drowned. In others, men caught with married women might face castration. The severity varied wildly across regions, but the underlying principle was the same. Sex was never just private. It was a public affair, with public consequence. And it wasn't just adultery. Sex outside marriage in general could bring charges. Young couples caught too often in barns or fields might be fined for fornication. Homosexual relationships, if discovered, faced brutal punishment, sometimes even burning at the stake. And prostitutes who strayed outside licensed areas could be whipped or banished from town. Another historical case. In 1460, a man in Paris was paraded through the streets wearing women's clothing as punishment for adultery. Cross-dressing was part of the humiliation, turning punishment into farce. The laughter of the crowd was the point. The worse the spectacle, you picture yourself being dragged forward, your neighbour's eyes burning into you, the priest shouting about sin while children snicker. Your mistake, whether born of passion or loneliness, has become everyone's entertainment. That's the cruelty of medieval punishment. It turned private longing into public shame. And yet, the punishments reveal something else too. How deeply communities cared about controlling sex. In a world where inheritance, reputation, and honor determined survival, sexual misconduct wasn't just personal. It was destabilizing. The harsh penalties were society's way of keeping order, even if it meant sacrificing individual dignity. Here's one last laugh. If medieval towns had Instagram, the punishment parade would have been the biggest live stream of the year. #Scarlet Letter Challenge. So as you step away from the jeering crowd and into the quiet of the night, remember, in the medieval world, sex carried risks far beyond the bedroom. It could lift you into whispered songs or drag you into the marketplace, where your neighbours laughed as you carried your shame like a torch. You've just watched adulterers stumble through the marketplace under jeers and rotten cabbage, but not all love that dared not speak its name was punished so openly. Tonight, you shuffle into a shadowed corner of medieval society where whispered desires took forms that the church and law declared unnatural. Here lies the hidden story of queer love, same-sex passion, gender nonconformity, and relationships that existed in the shadows, sometimes tender, sometimes perilous, and almost always dangerous. You slip into a monastery garden at twilight. Two novices walk together, their shoulders brushing as they talk in low voices. To outsiders it looks like brotherly companionship, but their hands linger, their glances betray more. Such bonds often flourished in spaces where men or women lived apart from the opposite sex. Monasteries, nunneries, guild halls. Desire didn't vanish with vows of chastity. It redirected, finding comfort in the people who were near. One quirky detail. Court records from medieval Europe show charges of sodomy, not only against men, but occasionally against women. In some cases, women were accused of using carved wooden devices to mimic male bodies. The punishments ranged from fines to executions, though evidence suggests enforcement was uneven. Sometimes people turned a blind eye, other times they made brutal examples. Historians still debate how widespread same-sex relationships were. Some argue that the harsh laws themselves prove such relationships must have been relatively common. Why legislate what never happens? Others caution that many accusations came from slander or political attacks, weaponizing sexuality against rivals. The reality is likely both. Same-sex love existed, sometimes consensual, sometimes exploited, but always under the risk of condemnation. Let's ground this with a historical example. The trial records of 1477 in Speyer, Germany, describe two women, Katharina Hetzeldorfer and her companion, accused of living together as man and wife. Katharina was executed by drowning. Her case shows both the reality of queer partnerships and the terrifying consequences when communities chose to enforce the harshest law. But not every story ended in tragedy. Some medieval texts preserve glimpses of tenderness. Letters between women, filled with language of longing and affection, blur the line between deep friendship and romantic love. Monastic rules occasionally warned against particular friendships among nuns, suggesting that such bonds were noticeable enough to worry superiors. Whether platonic or erotic, they mattered deeply to the women involved. You wander into a noble court, where poetry circles flourish. Some troubadour songs, often ignored by prudish scribes, celebrate love between men. In Arabic poetry from medieval Spain, homoerotic themes were sometimes sung openly, admired for their artistry even as clerics frowned. These verses remind us that queer love wasn't just hidden. In some cultures, it could be celebrated in coded form. Here's your joke break. If medieval Grindr had existed, it probably would have been disguised as a prayer app. Find nearby brothers in Christ. Punishments, though, were no joke. In many regions, sodomy was considered a capital crime. Florence, famously artistic, also kept extensive records of sodomy trials. Young apprentices and older men were sometimes charged, the courts balancing between moral outrage and the quiet acknowledgement that everyone knew it happened. The very thoroughness of these records shows both obsession and yet, desire found ways. In crowded guild halls, in cloisters, in travelling companies of actors, people carved out secret spaces for affection. Some faced ruin when discovered. Others lived quietly, their love hidden in plain sight as friendship. The blurry line between the acceptable and the forbidden gave cover for another historical note. Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, faced rumours of same-sex relationships, including claims he shared a bed with King Philip II of France during negotiations. Historians still debate whether this was slander, propaganda, or a kernel of truth. The fact that such accusations could even be made against a king shows how sexuality was. You pause in that shadowed garden, listening to the low voices of those two novices. You realise their risk. Discovery could mean lashes, exile, or worse. But their courage, their quiet laughter, their stolen moments also remind you that queer love in the Middle Ages wasn't just about fear. It was also about resilience, about finding joy even when the world tried to erase you. And here's one last laugh for the night. Medieval courts acted like they could ban love with punishments. But honestly, trying to outlaw desire was like trying to outlaw gravity. People just kept falling. So as you close your eyes, hearing those whispers fade into the chant of distant prayers. Remember, queer love in the medieval world wasn't new, wasn't rare, and wasn't erased. It lived in letters, poems, rumours, and brave hearts that kept beating in the shadows. You leave the shadows of hidden love and walk into a cramped little cottage that smells of rosemary and smoke. A hunched woman stirs a pot over the fire, muttering words half in prayer, half in something older. On the table are bundles of herbs, scraps of parchment with charms scrawled on them, and a small leather pouch that jingles faintly when she shakes it. Tonight, you've stepped into the world of sex and magic, where lust was not just about bodies but also about potions, spells, and fears of curses. You shuffle closer, and the woman peers at you with sharp eyes. "Looking for a love potion?" she asks, dropping crushed fennel seeds into wine. Medieval people were convinced that herbs and charms could spark or extinguish passion. A sprig of basil slipped under a pillow might make someone dream of you. A potion made with apple seeds and honey promised to inflame desire. And if your partner seemed uninterested, well, someone might have cursed them with impotence. Better hire a cunning woman to break the spell. One quirky detail. Some texts describe men tying little knots in string while reciting prayers backward to prevent rivals from consummating their marriages. These so-called love knots were believed to physically block a man's ability to perform. Imagine fumbling nervously on your wedding night while half the village whispers, "Someone must have tied the knot." Historians still debate how widespread belief in sex magic was. Some argue it was a fringe practice condemned by the church, while others note that trial records, sermons, and even medical manuscripts are littered with references to charms and potions. The fact that bishops railed against them suggests they were common enough to be a real concern. Let's anchor this with a historical moment. The Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, that infamous witch-hunting manual, devotes entire sections to sexual sorcery. It warns that witches could steal men's genitals, make women barren, or inflame lust through demonic spells. The hysteria surrounding witchcraft reveals just how much medieval society feared losing control of sex through supernatural means. You picture a nobleman panicking, convinced his mistress has bewitched him. He rushes to confess to a priest, who prescribes prayers and holy water. Meanwhile, the local healer sells him an herbal charm to hang over the bed. He does both, just in case. That's how medieval people lived. One foot in church, one foot in superstition. Here's your joke break. If medieval men had a WebMD symptom checker, every search result would say, "Relax, you're not cursed, you just need a nap." But magic wasn't only about problems. Lovers used charms to attract and keep affection. Women tucked mandrake roots under mattresses. Men carried amulets engraved with Venus symbols, and both whispered incantations over food or drink. Some even wore dried animal parts as talismans, everything from hare hearts to dried testicles of roosters, believing they radiated sexual energy. Romantic? Only if you're into the smell of poultry. And of course, not every potion was harmless. Some love charms doubled as contraceptives or abortifacients, using herbs like pennyroyal or rue. These gave women rare secret control over their bodies in a world where the church forbade contraception. But they also carried risks. Too much pennyroyal could kill, and mismeasured doses often did more harm than good. Another historical case. Inquisition records from Aragon in the 14th century describe women accused of giving soldiers enchanted wine to seduce them. The women defended themselves by saying they were only using folk remedies, but the church saw sorcery in every sip. Their trials show how easily ordinary sexual anxieties could spiral into accusations of witchcraft. You lean closer to the fire, watching the cunning woman whisper over her pot. The air grows thick with spice and smoke, and you wonder, did people truly believe? Or did they just need something to cling to when love felt uncertain? Maybe both. Magic offered hope where prayer felt too slow, where medicine felt too strange, and where desire felt too strong. And here's another laugh. Sex magic was basically the medieval version of Googling how to make him text back fast. So as you leave that smoky cottage and step into the night, clutching your little pouch of herbs, you realize medieval sex wasn't just shaped by politics, marriage, and punishment. It was also haunted by magic, by charms slipped under pillows, potions stirred in secrecy, and whispered spells that carried both danger and desire. You leave the smoky cottage behind, clutching your pouch of herbs, and now you stumble into a quieter, more anxious world, the gamble of pregnancy. In the Middle Ages, sex wasn't just about desire or reputation, it was about survival and risk. Every time a couple lay together, the possibility of conception loomed, and with it, the peril of childbirth. You shuffle into a small chamber where a woman grips a wooden bedpost, her face pale, as a midwife murmurs prayers and prepares cloth. Pregnancy in the medieval world was both expected and terrifying. Married women were judged by their ability to bear children, and lots of them. But the risks were brutal. Maternal mortality was high, and infant death even higher. A mother might deliver 10 times and lose half her children before they turned 5. Sex, for women, carried a weight men rarely faced. It was not only about pleasure or duty, but about putting life itself. One quirky detail: some women wore charms or recited prayers to saints specifically for fertility. St. Margaret of Antioch, who supposedly burst from a dragon's belly unharmed, was a popular patron for safe childbirth. Women even drank water in which her relics had been dipped, believing it would ease delivery. Not exactly epidurals. Historians still debate how effective medieval contraceptives were. Recipes survive in manuscripts describing herbal mixtures, pennyroyal, rue, and wild carrot seeds. Some were brewed as teas, others worn in pouches against the skin. Did they work? Modern science suggests a few had mild contraceptive properties, but dosage was unreliable and sometimes poisonous. Yet the very existence of these recipes shows women actively sought control over reproduction, even when the church thundered against it. Let's anchor this with a historical moment. The Trotula again, that famous 12th century medical text, included not just fertility advice but also instructions for hindering conception. It recommended smearing mixtures of herbs and animal fats, or placing amulets tied around the waist. Whether protective magic or proto-science, it shows women weren't passive. They experimented, they hoped. They resisted the idea that pregnancy was inevitable. You picture a peasant couple whispering in their straw bed. She has already borne 3 children, 2 of whom survived. Her body aches from work and nursing, and she dreads another pregnancy. He too worries. More children mean more mouths to feed. They boil herbs in secret, murmuring prayers as they sip the bitter brew. Will it work? Or will she be holding her belly again within months? Here's your joke break. Medieval contraception advice was basically, drink this weird tea and pray harder. Imagine explaining that to your teenage kids today. For noble women, the stakes were even higher. A queen's entire worth was often measured by her ability to produce heirs. Failure to conceive could mean annulment, disgrace, or being cast aside for a more fertile bride. Think of poor Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, who endured years of pregnancies, miscarriages, and stillbirths. Though later in the early modern period, her story echoed the same medieval fears. A woman's body judged as defective if it failed, and when pregnancy did occur, dangers loomed. Midwives were crucial, armed with herbs, rituals, and experience, but complications were common. Without antiseptics, infections spread easily. Hemorrhage could kill within hours. In some places, priests stood ready outside birthing rooms, prepared to baptize newborns immediately in case they died. That tells you how fragile life felt at the very threshold. Another chilling historical record. In 15th century Florence, some women left wills before childbirth, knowing they might not survive. These documents listed not jewelry or estates but simple items: linen gowns, rosary beads, prayer books. Even ordinary mothers faced the bed as though it were a battlefield. You sit quietly in that chamber, watching the midwife place amulets under the bed, whispering charms alongside the Ave Maria. Every contraction is a gamble, every prayer a plea. You realize sex in this world wasn't just about desire or shame. It was about whether both mother and child would live to see more. And here's another laugh, just to ease the weight. If medieval couples had baby shower registries, the top items would have been a healthy saint on speed dial and a larger graveyard plot. Grim humour, but that was life. So as you step back into the cool night air, the cries of childbirth fading behind you, you understand that every embrace carried consequences far greater than passion. In the medieval world, Sex and pregnancy were bound together by threads of fear, hope, and the relentless cycle of life and death. You step out from the dim, smoky cottage of childbirth and now wander through the echoing halls of a stone fortress. Torches flare against walls hung with hunting trophies, guards shuffle at their posts, and servants scurry like shadows. Tonight, you're in the royal bedroom, or rather, the royal stage. Because here, sex isn't private or tender. Imagine being a queen, married at 15 to a king twice your age. You don't get to choose him, and you certainly don't get to choose when he visits your chamber. The bed isn't yours. It's a dynastic machine. The court waits eagerly for signs of your fertility, a rounded belly, a living heir, a political guarantee. Your body is not yours, it's the kingdom's. One quirky detail. Some royal weddings required the presence of witnesses even at consummation. In France, attendants literally led the couple to bed, blessing the sheets, while dignitaries stood nearby to confirm the marriage was valid. Imagine your wedding night with an audience of bishops, scribes, and curious nobles. Awkward doesn't even cover it. Historians still debate how often royal consummations were truly witnessed, or if some accounts were exaggerated for effect. But letters and chronicles suggest it happened often enough to be tradition, especially when powerful alliances were at stake. For kings and queens, intimacy wasn't intimacy, it was proof, notarized by courtiers. Let's anchor this in a historical example. King Edward II of England and Isabella of France, married in 1308. Chroniclers gossiped endlessly about Edward's relationships with his male favourites, especially Piers Gaveston. Isabella, meanwhile, endured the role of producing heirs while competing for her husband's attention with another man. Their marriage became infamous, not because it was unusual for kings to have lovers, but because Edward flaunted his so openly. The political fallout nearly tore the kingdom apart. You wander through the royal apartments and notice the hierarchy of relationships. Kings often had official mistresses, recognized by court, sometimes rewarded with lands and titles. Queens endured these arrangements, forced to smile politely while their husbands paraded lovers at feasts. For noblemen, mistresses were a perk of power. For noble women, affairs were dangerous gambles that could top. Here's your joke break. Medieval kings basically invented the phrase, "It's not cheating if it's politics." But mistresses weren't just bed partners. Many wielded enormous influence. Alice Perez, mistress of Edward III, was accused of manipulating court politics, using her position to enrich herself and allies. Agnes Sorel, mistress of Charles VII of France, became so influential she was called the first official royal mistress in history. Queens might be crowned, but mistresses often held the king's ear in private, and sometimes his purse. Of course, queens weren't powerless. Some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, used their positions to command armies, lead political negotiations, and even shape culture. But when it came to sex, their roles were tightly scrutinized. A barren queen risked annulment. A queen accused of adultery risked death. One of the most infamous cases was Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife. Though slightly later than the medieval period, her trial shows how accusations of infidelity, true or not, could destroy queens in a... You pause at the heavy canopy bed, draped in crimson and gold, and imagine the weight that lay on it. Every sigh, every silence, every child born or lost became political currency. When a queen bore a son, bells rang across the realm. When she miscarried, rumours of divine punishment spread. Sex here wasn't passion, it was policy. And what about the servants? They knew everything. Royal bedchambers were bustling places, full of chamberlains, ladies-in-waiting and guards. Secrets rarely stayed secret. Chronicles are full of bedchamber gossip, fueling scandals. It was impossible for a king's affairs or a queen's rare rebellion to stay hidden long. Another historical glimpse. In 15th century Burgundy, Duke Philip the Good openly acknowledged his dozens of illegitimate children, many raised with noble titles. For him, sex outside marriage wasn't scandal, it was dynasty building. Meanwhile, his duchess endured quietly, her own power measured not by passion but by survival. Here's one more joke to soften the velvet weight. If medieval royals had tabloids, every headline would be, "King spotted leaving mistress's chamber again. Queen not a..." So as you walk out of that echoing fortress bedroom, you realise, in royal chambers, sex was never just about bodies. It was about heirs, alliances, and power. Queens endured, kings indulged, and mistresses manoeuvred, all under the watchful gaze of courtiers, chroniclers, and rivals. And for the crown, every kiss, every birth, every rumour could alter the fate of nations. You leave the crimson-draped bed of kings and queens, and step onto a dusty road lined with way stations and roadside shrines. The air hums with the clatter of hooves, the creak of wagons, and the chatter of men far from home. Tonight you're not in the village or the court. You're on the road, travelling with soldiers, crusaders, and pilgrims. And here you see another truth of medieval sex. When men and women travelled, desire travelled with them, crossing borders, carrying scandal. Picture a crusader camp outside Jerusalem. Tents flap in the desert wind, fires glow in the night, and soldiers laugh over skins of wine. Some write letters home to wives they haven't seen in years, while others seek out local women or boys, despite sermons warning of sin. Chroniclers describe crusader armies accompanied by camp followers, women who cooked, washed, sometimes fought, and often offered sex. For many soldiers, these relationships blurred the line between companionship and transaction. One quirky detail: pilgrims to holy shrines were notorious for their less-than-holy behaviour. Records from Santiago de Compostela in Spain mention taverns and brothels springing up along the pilgrimage routes. Some clerics joked that the Camino cured not just souls, but also appetites of another kind. Imagine trudging hundreds of miles on blistered feet, then celebrating with ale, dancing, and maybe a tumble in the hay. Historians still debate how much of this behaviour was exaggerated by moralising churchmen. Some chroniclers delighted in shaming crusaders and pilgrims, accusing them of hypocrisy. Others argue the accounts reflect genuine concern. Armies and pilgrim routes really did become hubs of mingling, temptation, and scandal. After all, whenever thousands of people travel together, human desires tag along. Let's anchor this with a historical moment. During the First Crusade, 1096-1099, chroniclers complained bitterly of soldiers consorting with women in camp, calling it a distraction from God's work. Later, Richard the Lionheart famously dismissed his wife after the crusade and was accused of keeping male companions closer than any queen. Whether slander or truth, such stories reveal how travel created both opportunities and gossip. You walk along a road in France where a band of young pilgrims passes. Among them are peasants, merchants, even widows seeking redemption. Along the way, bonds form, friendships, flirtations, sometimes quick marriages performed by roadside priests. Travel was dangerous, but also freeing. Away from watchful neighbours, people could reinvent themselves. A widow might travel as a wife again. A priest might quietly indulge in forbidden company. And young lovers could run far from their families. Here's your joke break. If medieval Tinder existed, every bio would have said, "Just a humble pilgrim, 300 miles walked, looking for a miracle." And then there were mercenaries. After wars, bands of unemployed soldiers roamed the countryside, often leaving behind more than just destruction. Villages complained of pregnancies, disease, and scandals trailing behind these armed wanderers. The church condemned them, but towns quietly adapted, creating rules to manage the inevitable. Another historical glimpse. In the 14th century Avignon, papal authorities tried to regulate pilgrim hostels, forbidding innkeepers from running brothels on the side. The fact that laws had to be written suggests business was booming. Pilgrimage, for all its holy trappings, became a lively mix of devotion, tourism, and desire. You imagine yourself trudging with blistered feet toward a holy shrine. The crowd around you is half praying, half flirting. Vendors hawk charms, musicians strum bawdy tunes, and behind the next tavern a soldier leans a little too close to a serving girl. You realize that journeys didn't just test faith, they tested fidelity. Here's another laugh. Crusaders were promised heaven for their sacrifices, but many seemed determined to sample earthly delights along the way. Just travel carried risks, of course. Along with scandal came disease. The mingling of armies and pilgrims helped spread infections across borders, fueling later epidemics. Desire was as mobile as soldiers' boots, as persistent as pilgrims' prayers. And while kings and bishops tried to legislate morality, the open road offered freedom and temptation that laws couldn't leash. So as you rest beneath a roadside shrine, dust clinging to your cloak, you realize medieval sex wasn't just confined to home, court or cloister. It wandered with soldiers and saints, followed banners and relics, and left traces in every tavern, hostel and campfire. The road was long, the temptations many, and the stories unforgettable. You've marched with crusaders and limped with pilgrims, but tonight you shuffle into a crowded infirmary. The air reeks of sweat, smoke and vinegar. Groans echo from straw pallets lined in uneven rows. Candlelight flickers across pale, fevered faces. This is where medieval sex shows its darkest shadow, disease. Because wherever desire travelled, sickness followed. And in an age before the late 15th century, syphilis hadn't yet erupted in Europe, but gonorrhea and other infections already plagued communities. They didn't have precise names for them. Doctors described them as burning flux, or the shameful disease. A man might wake up unable to urinate without pain, or a woman might suffer sores and fevers. With no antibiotics, treatments were brutal. Cauterization with hot irons, smearing mercury salves, or endless prayers. Imagine explaining your problem to a priest while holding very still as a barber surgeon approaches with a red-hot poker. One quirky detail: some believed that bathing could actually cause illness, not cure it. Public bathhouses were popular spots for socializing and sex, but as plague spread, suspicion grew. People whispered that the warm, steamy rooms bred disease. By the 14th century, especially after the Black Death, many Europeans abandoned public baths altogether. Cleanliness was dangerous, they thought. Historians still debate whether avoiding baths made disease worse or actually protected people from contaminated water. What's certain is that fears of contagion reshaped sexual culture. Bathhouses that once doubled as discreet brothels became suspect, and authorities shut many down. Let's anchor this with a historical moment. The Great Plague of 1347-1351, the Black Death. Though not sexually transmitted, it changed how people viewed intimacy. Chroniclers describe people avoiding even their own spouses for fear of infection. In cities like Florence, some couples lived apart entirely during outbreaks, intimacy replaced by isolation. For a society obsessed with fertility, these years of abstinence and fear left deep scars. You wander into a city street where rumours of a new disease swirl. By the late 15th century, syphilis exploded across Europe, likely carried by soldiers returning from campaigns in Italy. Nicknamed the French disease by the Italians and the Italian disease by the French, blame bounced across borders like a hot potato. Victims suffered ulcers, rashes and disfigurement so shocking that some described the illness as divine punishment for lust. Treatments? Mercury baths and ointments which poisoned as much as they healed. Spend a night with Venus, a lifetime with mercury. Here's your joke break. Medieval medicine basically offered two options: burn it or smear mercury on it. Both sound less like cures and more like dares. Disease didn't just sicken bodies, it reshaped morals. Clerics thundered that lust caused plagues, that prostitutes carried curses, that God himself sent illness as punishment. Brothels were closed, laws tightened, and sermons grew harsher. Yet none of it stopped desire. Even in plague years, records show people sneaking into bathhouses or visiting lovers. The risk of illness became part of the gamble. Another historical case: in 1495, syphilis tore through Naples so violently that entire armies collapsed, soldiers covered in sores, too weak to fight. Chroniclers wrote that the disease seemed fiercer than leprosy, more terrifying than plague, and more humiliating than both. The link between sex and death had never... You picture yourself lying in that crowded infirmary, listening to groans, the priest whispering last rites over one bed while a surgeon sharpens a knife nearby. In this world, the same act that could bring life and pleasure might just as easily bring... And here's one more laugh. If medieval people had dating profiles under deal breakers, they'd all write, "Please no leprosy." So as you leave the reeking infirmary and step into the night air, you realize, in medieval times, sex carried risks beyond scandal or gossip. It carried disease, fear, and sometimes death. And yet, despite the dangers, people kept reaching for each other in the dark, because desire, even when shadowed by plague, was stronger than fear. You leave the plague-ridden infirmary and stumble into a quieter room, a scriptorium where monks bend over parchment, quills scratching by candlelight. You expect Bibles and sermons, but as you lean closer, you see something unexpected in the margins. Tiny doodles, playful rhymes, and cheeky illustrations wink at you from between the sacred texts. Tonight, you've found the secret world of medieval erotic literature where desire spilled out not in whispers but in ink. You shuffle closer to one manuscript and nearly laugh. There, next to a psalm, a tiny drawing of a man bending over, trousers down, chased by rabbits with horns. Another margin shows nuns harvesting phallic-looking plants, their baskets overflowing. These weren't mistakes. Scribes had senses of humour, and they couldn't resist doodling what was on their minds. Eroticism crept into even the holiest books, hidden in plain sight. One quirky detail: bawdy songs called Carmina circulated among students and clerics. The most famous, the Carmina Burana, compiled in the 11th-12th centuries, is full of drinking songs, love poems, and raunchy verses about desire. Yes, the same collection that inspired Karl Orff's dramatic O Fortuna also contains lines about tavern hookups. The contrast is glorious, from high culture to low smut in a single manuscript. Historians still debate how common erotic marginalia was. Some say it was widespread satire, a way for monks to poke fun at authority while bored during long copying sessions. Others think only a mischievous few dared slip in naughty doodles. But given how many survive, it seems desire had a way of sneaking onto the page, no matter the rules. Let's anchor this with a historical example. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, late 14th century. Written in Middle English, it's one of the most famous works of medieval literature. But alongside pious pilgrims, Chaucer gave us the bawdy Miller's Tale, where a carpenter's young wife tricks her lover into kissing her bare backside through a window. Crude, hilarious, and shockingly direct, it proves that medieval audiences laughed at sex as much as we do now. You flip another parchment and find recipes for lust potions scribbled in the margins of medical texts. Or you see courtly love poems copied and recopied, sometimes with scandalous tweaks added by later scribes. Erotic literature didn't just survive, it thrived, passed hand to hand like forbidden treasure. Here's your joke break. If medieval libraries had a restricted section, it wasn't for dark magic, it was for dirty poems monks couldn't stop giggling about. Beyond doodles and jokes, erotic art also lived in manuscripts like The Romance of the Rose, a 13th century allegorical poem. Ostensibly about love's philosophy, it's packed with innuendo, symbolic gardens, and metaphors of plucking flowers that fooled no one. It became wildly popular, copied across Europe, sparking debates about morality. Was it philosophy? Was it smut? Historians still debate, but medieval readers clearly loved it. Another fascinating case. In 15th century Italy, Priapus poems, classical verses celebrating oversized male anatomy, were recopied with enthusiasm. Humanists claimed it was about studying antiquity, but the jokes scribbled in the margins suggest otherwise. Even the intellectual elite couldn't resist a dirty joke disguised as scholarship. And then there's art beyond manuscripts. Ivory combs carved with lovers entwined, pilgrim badges shaped like genitalia sold at fairs, yes, really, and playing cards featuring cheeky scenes. Archaeologists keep finding objects that show medieval people weren't as prudish as stereotypes suggest. They laughed, they flirted, they carried little erotic trinkets in pockets. You picture yourself in that scriptorium, watching a monk smirk as he slips a saucy rhyme into the corner of a holy text, or a group of students singing bawdy verses in a tavern, tankards sloshing. You realize that medieval people like us found relief in humour, satire, and fantasy. Eroticism wasn't just physical, it was cultural, a shared language of laughter and rebellion. Here's one last laugh. Medieval scribes had no internet, but they still managed to invent memes, just inked onto parchment instead of posted on Reddit. So as you set the manuscript back down, the ink still smelling faintly of age, you realize medieval sex wasn't only lived in bed or punished in the streets. It was imagined, sung, doodled, and laughed over in texts that survive centuries later. Desire left its mark not just on bodies but on books, forever scribbled into the margins of history. You close the manuscript with its cheeky doodles and bawdy verses, and now you lie back, letting the long swirl of medieval sex sink in. You've walked through smoky peasant huts, crimson-draped royal chambers, rowdy brothels and quiet cloisters. You've seen desire dressed up as poetry, condemned as sin, taxed as business, punished as crime, feared as disease, and whispered into charms and potions. Tonight you reach the afterglow, the long reflection that medieval sex wasn't just about two people in a bed. It was about communities watching, priests preaching, rulers scheming, and healers prescribing. It was about politics and property, shame and survival. And yet, for all the rules, punishments and dangers, desire never disappeared. It slipped through cracks, it whispered in songs, it doodled itself into margins, it risked everything for a One quirky detail. Even wills sometimes mention lovers. A man in 14th century England left a feather bed and my best jug of ale to a woman not his wife. The fact that these notes slipped into legal documents shows how desire left traces everywhere. Historians still debate how much ordinary people cared about church rules, how strictly punishments were applied, and how common secret affairs really were. Some see a world suffocated by control. Others see endless evidence of resistance. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. A society that wanted to police desire, but could never. Let's anchor this closing with a historical moment. The Paston Letters of 15th century England, where family correspondence reveals worries about dowries, marriages, and chastity. In one letter, a mother frets over her daughter's reputation, terrified that gossip will ruin a good match. Centuries later, her words still sound familiar. Concern, control. You close your eyes and imagine lying in a straw bed, in a noble chamber, in a convent cell. The smells shift: smoke, perfume, incense, herbs. The sounds shift: laughter, chants, groans, scribbled rhymes. But the human pulse beneath it all stays constant. Medieval sex was never only about sin or only about joy. It was always about being human in a world that tried so hard to define what that meant. Here's your last joke. If medieval people could see our dating apps, they'd probably still find a way to ask, but do you own 2 oxen? So now, as the candles gutter low and the night air cools, let yourself drift. Picture the long afterglow of centuries past, where lovers hid behind curtains, priests frowned from pulpits, poets winked in rhymes, and humanity, despite everything, kept reaching for warmth in the dark. And now, as the journey ends, slow your breathing, soften your thoughts. The torches are out, the laughter has faded, and the manuscripts are closed. What lingers is not the noise of punishments or the rules of priests, but the quiet truth that even in the Middle Ages, amid dirt, danger and judgment, people still reached for each other. They still found joy, mischief, tenderness and connection, even when the images blur now. A peasant couple sneaking a smile after a day in the fields, a noble knight tying a lady's veil to his armour, a nun whispering softly through a grill, a queen staring at the canopy above her bed, praying for a safe birth. They are distant, yet familiar. Because if anything, this long night has shown you that their desires were not so different from yours. The clothes were rougher, the rules harsher, you let your thoughts drift, hearing the soft rustle of straw turning into the hum of your own sheets. The medieval world fades into mist, its noise softening until only the gentle rhythm of breath remains. The gossiping crowds, the scolding priests, the singing troubadours, they all dissolve, leaving you with a hush that feels almost holy. Now turn off the lights. Maybe leave the fan humming. Maybe let some soft background music play. Let the centuries melt away as you close your eyes. The story has ended, but the lull remains. You are safe, you are warm, and you are far from the noisy beds of medieval Europe. Drift gently now until sleep carries. End of script. Good night.